Today I'm excited to bring to you guys a new way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And now while these rules may be unofficial, they are an extremely interesting way to rethink how you build decks and play strategy within the card game in a version of Yu-Gi-Oh! That pretty much allows every player to have their own boss monster or god card. This version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Also restores the normal monster's ability to have some relevance. We're calling this Yu-Gi-Oh! Neo-Duel, in a version of Yu-Gi-Oh! That only has one singular column to play on. Now what you guys are used to is something more akin to this big field that I have here, which is in Master Duel, or the 3-columned field that you have in Duel Links and Speed Duel. So first off, let me show you what the mat looks like for this playstyle. As you can see from this image, there's only one column to play monsters in addition to one extra monster zone and or Neo monster zone. There are only 11 fundamental changes to the game other than the playstyle of the field layout. This new field layout actually changes a lot fundamentally about how the game is going to be played here forward. Just think of cards like Swords of Revealing Light, where if I were to play it in my Spell and Trap zone, I would have other Spell and Trap zones freed up, locking my opponent out of attacking for 3 whole turns. However, in this version of the game, having only one column to play with, Swords of Revealing Light naturally balances out to being a card that now prevents you from playing spells and traps essentially for 3 turns, and your opponent from attacking for 3 turns. An interesting way to play the card. A lot of mechanics with different cards will change in this way to suit this format. Before we go over the rules with Neo-Duel, I'd like to explore this mat just a little bit more and explain exactly what's going on here. You have your deck zone, the place where you'll place your main deck between 10 and 15 cards. You'll have a singular spell or trap zone, an extra deck zone, a field spell zone, a main monster zone that will operate exactly like the traditional main monster zone that you know and love, and of course a graveyard zone. The only thing changing dramatically here being the columns and the Neo/extra monster zone. This zone functions exactly how an extra monster zone does, with the addition of Neo monsters, which we'll get into in just a moment. Okay guys, so with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about what the rules for Yu-Gi-Oh! Neo-Duel even are. Why should you play this format? Rule number 1 is that normal monsters can be normal summoned without tributes. This does mean indeed that you can just slap a Red Eyes, Dark Magician, and or Blue Eyes down onto the field without paying tributes. Number 2, normal monsters can be summoned to either the Neo or main monster zone, allowing players to place a normal monster in the Neo zone and then perhaps a tuner or something like that in the main monster zone, still allowing you to synchro summon even though there's only one column of cards. Number 3, you can place a normal monster in your extra deck as a Neo monster, which we'll explain a bit more later in the video. This does include any normal XY, Z, synchro, etc. type monsters as long as they do not have a card effect. This one is kind of lengthy, so forgive me for having to read it from my phone. But number 4, Neo monsters cannot be placed in defense mode and they have no defense stat. Neo is placed in the card name at all times. You can only have one of each card name as a Neo monster in your extra deck at a time. Their attack is the combined total of the original normal monster's attack and defense points. For example, if you had a Blue Eyes White Dragon that you wanted to use as the Neo monster in your extra deck, you would simply place it as a Neo Blue Eyes White Dragon with a stats of 5500 and no defense stat. This is very similar to Link monsters in the way that they operate, having no defense stat and basically just having an attack stat. We'll get to how you summon Neo monsters in a moment in a section called How to Summon Neo Monsters. So number 5 is that you start with 6,000 life points rather than 4, 2, or 8. Number 6 is that you start with 2 cards. So instead of drawing a whole bunch of cards, you're only going to have 2 cards to start the game with. The hand size limit becomes 4 cards, so at the end of the turn, if you have 5 cards, you've got to discard one. Number 8, you can only Neo summon once per turn. Number 9, this one's tricky. When Neo monsters are sent to the graveyard, they're sent there face down. Number 10, the deck size limit becomes between 10 and 15 cards, while the extra deck becomes a max of 5. And finally, if you control no monsters and have no cards in your hand and control no spells and traps, basically if you have no cards, you can draw 2 cards for your draw phase instead of 1. So digging into these rules just a little bit, I'd like to make a few things clear so that you guys understand how the Neo monsters and Neo-Duel rules are supposed to work.
So here I've made like a 3D model for you guys to kind of check out what Neo-Duel is all about. Neo-Duel is about practicality and shrinking down the game in a way that makes it more realistic to actually just like take it out and play it at a restaurant, or even with the Duel Disks size and functionality to just basically make something more relatable to be able to be slapped onto your wrist and about the size of a cell phone, which I've built one in real life that I'll show you guys as well. But for now, let's go over everything that has changed about the field layout and what you might have to think about when playing. So right now I've made a kind of mock field. So I'm going to remove the cards from the board to make it just a little easier to tell what's going on here. And let's increase the size. So as you can see from this field layout, we have our side over here on this side. We have the deck, the spell and trap zone, the extra deck zone, the field spell zone, the main monster zone, the graveyard, and our extra / Neo monster zones. Now I did explain this briefly in the other chunk of the video, but I just wanted to go over it real quickly just so we knew where everything stood. So if we're looking at the different zones where you can summon monsters and things like that, we're going to highlight those, and the zones where we can summon monsters are all yellow. You'll notice that's basically where all the normal monsters can be placed, or effect monsters can be summoned here, Neo monsters and extra deck monsters there, etc. Now we do have that spell and trap zone highlighted, and of course this is just to make it really clear and easy, just in case someone doesn't understand the basics of where these are going to be at, because the one column thing can really throw you off. Speaking of which, let's talk about the battle zones on this field. So technically, there are only this column and this one here on this row that isn't even necessarily a row, it's just the extra deck monsters across from each other. So as you can tell, we kind of just shrunk it down to one singular column for monsters to really interact with each other, other than basically taking over this one. So those are some of the basic changes to the field layout that will really affect how you play going forward. But of course, you guys probably want to see what the Duel Disks are about and how they may function with this new version of the card game. And yes, we will be using this version of the Duel Disk in the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Neo-Duel show that we will be producing in short versions for you guys to not only explain how the card game works in this format, but to give you an awesome live-action Yu-Gi-Oh! Show, as we've been meaning to update some sort of Yu-Gi-Oh! Live-action project for quite some time. So I've designed these in many different colors. You can see we've got a black, purple, blue, the red, and green. I originally went with this red design here, as I really liked it. However, it looked too much like a Pokédex to me. So I decided to try them out in several different colors. Now here on the Duel Disk, if we flip it around, you can kind of see it's got a cool design on the back there. I did like a posable bracelet type of thing like they did on the actual Duel Disks. This is only meant to be about the size of a cell phone, or maybe something a little bit bulkier on the top of the wrist, which I'll show you guys. I have a 3D model for that in just a moment. But as for now, you can see we've got the field spell spot going straight into the side here, your spell and trap being in the bottom, just like a normal Duel Disk would be, where you just kind of place the cards up above the monster. Now this is the most unique part of the Duel Disk, as we've placed the extra monster zone as the top monster zone and the main monster zone right here. This is mainly because, for the most part, when you play your Neo and extra monster zones, it won't matter too much, except for Link monsters, which zone you choose to summon into. So it's not like this one's immediately my zone and that one's his or anything like that. Whoever summons first gets to pick the zone and everything, but this is more suited towards, like, tribute summoning. It can be a format where you link summon, but you'd literally have to summon one and then another, and then just keep squeezing two specific monsters together to keep climbing the link ladder. So I think playing a normal monster and a tuner and then synchro summoning is a much easier way to get to big deck monsters in this particular format. So all ways of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Are viable. There are just tricks and ways around it in this particular format. Back to the Duel Disk, you can see we've got the deck spot right here, and we've got the main monster zone and a graveyard spot. Now I like to make this little interesting thing underneath the deck spot where the extra deck could go. This way you could just kind of like backwards draw for your extra deck monsters and slap them down, but you could also make something on the end here. Now this is just a basic life point counter. I've made a few different designs for the Duel Disk. This is the one I've kind of settled on. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Of course, it's intended to fold over, and you're probably wondering about the little spike. The spike is intended to slide down into this side here, and it's going to fold over kind of like a Game Boy SP. I had actually always wondered why the Yu-Gi-Oh! Company, Konami, or Upper Deck, or whoever owned it at the time didn't just make a DS game where they would put the Duel Disk on your wrist in the shape of like a DS of some kind, and then play a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game in that format, because they actually had like Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Spirit Color and Nightmare Troubadour and a bunch of games that actually really suited this kind of format, where the top of the field where this was your top-down screen, and this one showed you like a 3D version of the field. So I don't understand why they never took that somewhere, but that's kind of the idea here, is we're going to choose something that small. This way it's the most practical thing you can actually use in real life. And we're going to 3D print these and test them and see how well all of this stuff works. And of course, this is going to be the main system we're going to be using for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Neo-Duel show. There will be some master dueling in there a little bit, but for the most part, we're going to stick to these really fast Neo-Duel games. And of course, this is meant to address actually being able to play a really fast game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Rather than just bum rushing the opponent by slamming a ton of monsters down, kind of like you do in Rush Duel. I'm not judging any of those formats. I just think this is a more strategic kind of one-on-one. If you've ever played War, the card game, where you basically draw a card, whoever has the highest one, you slap it down, and it's just back and forth like that. Think of it as more of a strategic version of that, as you get to pick the combo. And since there are tens of thousands of cards and tons of decks, and tons of combos within those decks, these decks are actually more aplenty, because they're basically just the combos that you're running. And honestly, being able to play normal monsters again is going to make a huge difference in the game. I can't wait to see what kind of decks you guys build. Definitely share your deck list below. I would love to see what you guys come up with. So here we have a 3D model of just a guy that I made here in the modeling sim, just to kind of give us a Yu-Gi-Oh!-esque character, kind of Devil May Cry looking dude. You guys know my style of shit. So here we go. I'm going to show you what the Duel Disk would kind of look like on a person. Now this is one of the previous models I was doing, where I was doing kind of like the spell and trap here, but I kind of like just the one fold. I think it'll make it much more manageable. This is more of the DS looking one that I was talking about, and I was going to give them like a screen that would describe what the cards are and life points. All that's too complicated for something that I really want to build in real life. I figured I would go with the other one so I could build an actual calculator into each Duel Disk. And I do like this design though. If we were going to go with like a DS design, this would be it. But honestly, that's about as big as we want them. You don't need this big hunky wing coming off the back here. You don't even really need this piece. So it's nice to actually kind of have this little character sim to just be able to see how big that was actually going to come out to be.
Basically, this version of the game is meant to enhance normal monsters to being more useful as a effect monster. So basically, as you can see on our zones here, we've got the main monster and Neo monster zone. A Neo monster can be placed in either of those zones, while as an effect monster can't. A normal monster can be placed in those zones, and an effect monster can only be played in the main monster zone, unless it's an extra deck card that is summoned to the extra zone. So that does help you with things like Fusion, Xyz, and Link, and also synchro as well. So any of those kind of playstyles that you want to play, you can play in this format. You've noticed there's only 10 to 15 cards in the deck. This version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is meant to be able to be played very quickly on the go with anybody who has just 10 and 15 cards on their person, and you can smack down your favorite combos with each player in the Neo-Duel format. Now, how we spice things up is the Neo Monsters. Neo Monsters are a way to basically use a giant beat stick type of monster, your own god card if you will, in each duel to beat down your opponent and basically reap them of that 6,000 life points as fast as you possibly can. There were a lot of releases of Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game versions that try to anchor us towards a more speedy version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Speed Duel, Duel Links, and all these things that have come out, and even Rush Duel, but they all seem to fail at making a game that you can actually logically play within like a couple of minutes without it just being a bum rush type of situation. So for this card game, we've made it to where you can actually play a lot of different variety of strategies. All of those strategies change fundamentally by playing the Neo-Duel rules, and then we additionally added in the spice of the Neo Monsters, giving you the ability to summon big monsters, and let's get into just how you do that. So in addition to being able to normal summon, set, XYZ, synchro, and do all the stuff that you can do on top of normal playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can also do what's called a Neo Summon. During the battle phase, you may send monsters that have not attacked on your side of the field to the graveyard, whose total attack and defense points are equal to or greater than the monster of the Neo monster that you want to summon. So basically what this means is, if I have, like that Blue Eyes earlier, I could normal summon Blue Eyes. He has no tributes, he's a normal monster. His attack stats total are 5,500. I could then go into battle phase, send that Blue Eyes to the graveyard, 2,500 defense and 3,000 attack, making 5,500 points total, and then summon a Neo Blue Eyes from the extra deck with just 5,500 attack. This is a way to basically turn a normal monster into a giant beat stick for this version of the game. Neo monsters are kind of an interesting mix of every card type in the game. As you can tell, they have a summoning mechanic that's similar to like synchro and all that, but with a little bit of a mix of the ritual in there. Basically, we're just going to squish all the points for one card together, or multiple cards together, to summon a big monster. Because let's say you had two monsters with 3,000 attack on the field, but you wanted to summon a Neo monster with 5,000 attack, you could squish those two 3,000s together, send them to the graveyard, and summon your 5,000 attack point Neo monster. But remember, you only get one Neo summon per turn, so you can't just climb the Neo summoning ladder the same way you would do with Link monsters. Neo monsters must be summoned into the Neo monster zone. You can only Neo summon once per turn, and just to clear things up, you can use Neo monsters to summon other Neo monsters. It's just they would have to wait a turn because you only get one per turn. But Neo monsters cannot be used to summon synchro, XYZ, Link, or other type of extra deck monsters. So this prevents them from getting completely broken by some of the other extra deck monster abilities. And finally, Neo monsters can be tributed for a tribute summon, so you can still get them off the field that way if you find some necessary reason to tribute summon your Neo monster.